I'm Karen Bauer. I work at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. I'm a specialist on tafsir and Quran, and especially matters to do with women and gender, but also hermeneutics, Quranic hermeneutics, and the hermeneutics within tafsir. And I've written or edited a number of volumes on these themes, which all kind of link one from the other. And so I thought I'd talk about each of them maybe in turn. So I started out on this theme when I was a grad student, actually, with my PhD. And what started me, I started on looking at verses of the Quran that had to do with women's status and the interpretation of those verses through time, the commentaries on those verses through time. And soon several things became apparent to me. This is some years ago, keep in mind. So by now this may be really obvious to anyone who might see this video, but at the time, what really struck me is that while we might have an idea of Islamic tradition as or of the genre of Quran commentary as comprehending the meaning of the text, actually what we were seeing was a lot of different possible meanings that were created through both the context of the authors and intellectual and social context of the authors, and also by the text itself. And so I was starting to come to this in my PhD. So while the focus was on verses to do with women, the things I was thinking about were much bigger. And I thought, I don't really know anything about what the aims of the authors are in writing these books. And so actually the first thing that I published was an edited volume. I edited a volume called Aims, Methods, and Context of Quranic Exegesis, 2nd or 8th to 9th, 15th centuries. A catchy title, you'll admit. And in that the idea of this conference and of the volume that it produced was that we use the word tafsir, and the word tafsir means, of course, explanation or explication. And we sometimes use it to mean strictly the genre of commentary. But what is going on in that genre? Because it's certainly not every type of tafsir of the Quran. You see very huge things are excluded from that genre. So through this conference, and I had a number of wonderful contributors who contributed to this volume, the idea was that we get a better sense of what actually the authors intended to do in this genre, so that we don't have the impression that actually they think they're doing everything, because they didn't think that they were doing everything. They had specific intentions, and those intentions, of course, varied from work to work. Then after that, I wrote the monograph that was actually based on the PhD itself, which was an analysis, it's called Gender Hierarchy in the Quran, but it's actually really not about the Quran. It's really about certain verses in the Quran and how they were interpreted through time. And what I did in that book, which I wasn't able to include in my PhD, was some more modern commentary, and that included some interviews of clerics in Iran. And I chose Iran. I mean, really, if I had been a modernist, I would have done both Sunni and Shi'i. But I just thought that I'll get one context, and that will at least show that there is a huge variety, actually, of interpretations within one context. Because another mistake that we can tend to make when we read works of tafsir is to think, well, this was the meaning in that time and place, when actually we may only have one work for a matter of 200 years or something. And actually within any one time and place, there would have been such a huge variety of interpretations. And you can get that in the modern period because you can speak to people about their interpretations. And so that's what I did in that book. And I mean, it really showed things like how our ideas of right and wrong, ideas that we might take it for granted about what's right to say and wrong to say, how that can influence the way that an interpretation goes. For instance, it was very common in the pre-modern period to understand, to interpret verses on the creation of man and woman as meaning that the woman was created in a derivative way from the man, and that she was a secondary creation. It's an extremely common interpretation, both Sunni and Shi'i. And in the modern period, people would not say that she's secondary, even if they say that she's derivative, even if they would still say that it was Eve created from Adam's rib, which, as many of us know, is not actually mentioned in the Quran in those ways. But even so, some people would say that okay, these verses refer to Eve created from Adam's rib, but they would say, but that doesn't mean that she's a secondary creation. That means that they're made of the same substance. So of course they're exactly equal, ontologically equal. And so that's that's a small example of the way that actually you can maintain certain things about an interpretation from the pre-modern period, but the substance of it changes in really crucial ways depending on what people think, depending on the what's considered to be right and wrong in that time and place. And then there's another one here, which is an anthology of Qur'anic commentaries, and actually this was co-written, and I mean, it says edited, but really we did quite a lot of analysis as well with my colleague Firas Hamza. And this is interpretations of many of those primary sources. It's actually translations of many of those primary sources for a number of Qur'anic verses. And this is intended as a scholarly resource, but it's also got significant analysis in there. We do have, for instance, some like terms that might be confusing, like fadl, like we've given a little explanation of some of these terms of and how they're used in the Quran, as well as well, I guess I could just talk about the organization of this book. Is that what I should do? Okay, so essentially what we have is an introduction to the volume. Then we have a what we call the prolegomenon, which is the Quranic lexicon on women, and that talks a little bit about the subject of women in the Quran. Then we have biographies of the commentators, and then we have select verses on the subject of women and commentaries on those verses. And this, I included some of the transcripts of the interviews that I did in Iran, and we did more interviews. We did interviews of Amina Wadud and Sadia Sheikh, modern feminists who had something, because we thought that they would have something very interesting to say about women, and they did. So we tried to get some sense of the variation in these interpretations, and to produce a work that would be that one could use in teaching about these subjects, both the subject of tafsir and the subject of women, and to have some contextualization there. Then, directly from the Anthology of Qur'anic Commentaries, as I said, there is one chapter here, a little bit about, it's called the Qur'anic Lexicon on Women. And what happened is that for this book, you know, we really came to see increasingly how the authors of tafsir, of the Quran commentaries through time, how they were affected by their own status, right? They're scholars, it's a scholarly genre, and they were all men, right? And the thing about people who have some power is that they don't often like to relinquish it. So they would say all kinds of things about women that are really unpalatable today. And we weren't exactly sure that was reflected in the Quran. So we thought to ourselves, let's include all the Quran's verses on women. We can't just leave it with tafsir. And so that was itself, we collected together every single verse that the Quran has on the subject of women, or the female, or the feminine. And we started to do an analysis. At first, we put them in chronological order, and that's where this little chapter came from. We took some of the terms and showed how the terminology changes through time. So moving away from terms like huris, which are the heavenly maidens, and towards terms like believing women, who become a really important part of things once you get into the later periods of the Quran, when the Quranic community is building, then the women are a part of that in the Medinan period. And so we did that analysis, but actually this chapter grew and grew and grew. Actually, by the time we had published this, the chapter was going to be 50,000 words. And we thought, no. And we weren't done at all with that chapter. So we just took a small excerpt of it. We published it in this book. And that became another book. And it actually became a book that's not solely about women in the Quran. What we found when we were writing about that subject is that a lot of things didn't make sense to us without some understanding of the historical context of the Quran. And by that, I mean not just that the Quran is a late antique text or that it was a patriarchal society. That everybody kind of knows that, right? But what did that mean? What did it mean for women's agency that they were living in that society? And what did it mean for the morality of the Quran? How was a moral text? How did a text that was ethical and moral deal with those hierarchical social structures? So actually, the book became much more about households, the structure of households, and how Quranic addresses are structured through households, and about patronage, an overarching social, which is an overarching social, I guess you'd say, structure that, which is how the weak and vulnerable people in the society were protected at the time, and how they in turn would give their loyalty to the person protecting them. And therefore you had a kind of stable society, but one which was potentially prone to some abuse or transgression. And so the Quran comes along, and we would say that it imposes a salvific frame on these existing social structures. So it became about kind of the social structures around that as they're reflected within the Quranic morality, and how that works for women in the text. And so that is that project, which should be out this year in 2023, we hope.